but just in case you're new, some things to keep in mind. Please make sure to keep your microphone muted unless you're specifically asked to unmute yourself. That will help us with background noise. If you've not yet already done so, please make sure that you identify yourself by name and or the city or organization you represent. If you need instructions on how to do that, you can find it in the chat. It does look like Mayor Sawyer's already using the chat and reminding everybody that the Seafood Wine and Festival in Newport starts today at noon. This webinar is actually a public space. It's open to everybody and it is being recorded. We will take questions from everybody at the end of all presentations from LOC lobbyists. We do keep ourselves to a 1 p.m. stopping time no matter what, and you can follow all of our legislative efforts on our website at www.orcities.org. So for today's legislative webinar, here's some key topics we're going to try and cover just off the top. We're going to do a brief overview of our overall lobbying efforts and some of the challenges that we're facing in the legislature this year. We'll give you some details on a potential 60-day housing package and the bills that are related to that. A proposed bill that will require certain commercial properties within certain conditions to be converted to residential uses. We'll give an update on the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department proposed budget. We will discuss the place-based water planning fund. There'll be an update on where things stand with the potential semiconductor package. We'll give you a review of the state's budget forecast. And we'll also finish up by talking about a proposed public contracting bill, as well as a bill related to what we call the duty to defend. So we've got a lot to talk about today, and hopefully we'll get through it. We do have a lot of LOC lobbyists on the call. As we have in the past, I'll ask them all to put their names and contact information in the chat. That way, if you have any follow-up questions, it's easy for you to find. So to kick things off today, I'm going to ask Jim McCauley, who's our legislative director, to kind of give us an overview of where we stand with our overall lobbying work. Some of the challenges that local governments are facing in this particular legislative session, and then just kind of a general overview of how we make the policy decisions we make, given the conditions we are experiencing. So Jim, what can you tell us?
Great, thank you very much. Welcome everybody. Again, we are, week 6 roughly into this session, and I think it's helpful to place some context on the work that we've got in front of us. I think there's nothing completely out of the ordinary in terms of what we face any given session. I mean, there's always a certain amount of chaos. There's always a lot of difficulty that we have in terms of being able to push some of our agendas and stop things and being able to advocate for any number of different things. And I think what's important to understand is that basically every session that comes along, that policy work, the legislative work that goes on is really in control of the party with the most votes. Now, this last election cycle, I'll say the Republicans were able to gain a couple of seats. So they're no longer in the super minority, but they are still in the minority significantly, such that a lot of the policy work that is done, or a lot of the legislative focus from the party that's in control, I don't want to suggest it's completely unfettered, but they have the ability to move bills through, especially the legislation that is a high priority for that particular party or that particular caucus. And that's, I think, something to keep in mind. And the reason why we are having these calls is to help provide that education for you, provide really what's coming up in the next week, and effectively where we need the help. The grassroots effort that we've had over the last 3-4 years has helped us out considerably. We have some ability to stop bad bills, but typically not on our own. So we have to form any number of different coalitions and alliances with other interests that are out there. And then again, we do very much rely on your involvement, being able to reach out to your legislators, provide them with a high level of education on why a bill is bad or why it is good, because it helps us overall with the framework. So in any given session, we at times are facing not a really good piece of legislation that clearly is going to be on the train, effectively is moving, whether we're there or not. And we do find ourselves in a situation sometimes trying to negotiate or work our tails off to try to reduce the impacts of what that legislation could be, on cities. And that could be anything from reducing the requirements. It could be trying to identify additional resources if needed, effectively for implementation of this. So it's not the greatest message to really start off our weekly call, but I think it helps place some context on what we face in any given legislative session, because I think it's an important component of how we have to lobby and the work that we end up doing any given time. And I just want you to know that your lobby team is doing everything possible to reduce the impacts of legislation that's not helpful for cities, doing everything possible to pass legislation that is, because that's really our role and our work that I think is helpful at the end of the day when we move through any given session. So I want to at least provide that with some context after kind of 6 weeks in. We still got a long way to go in this process. I think that's the other part, is there's a fair amount of patience that we all have on the lobbying side because we've been doing this for a while. Some of these conversations over some of our priorities are going to be an entire session's worth of conversation. So decisions are not necessarily made in the next week. And that's something, again, to keep in mind, because when we do send out alerts, we really do rely on your ability to respond. It's helpful in the end because it helps frame what's important to us. And I think everybody who's had a chance to respond to these alerts over the last few weeks, it's been incredibly helpful. We have legislators that make comments to us all the time and recognize, I'll just say, having real people provide testimony or provide written comments and stuff on the record. We're your lobby team. We can articulate it, but I think hearing back from local elected officials is ultimately the best source of lobbying work or advocacy work that's out there, and we certainly appreciate it. So that is my pitch. Patty, I don't know if you want to take any questions from folks or if we should just hold those until the end.
Let's just hold those to the end, just in terms of looking at everything that we have, but just keep this context in mind in case you have questions on this particular issue or some concerns. We can chat at the end. But in talking about difficult decisions and ways to maneuver, I'm going to ask Ariel Nelson, our housing and land use lobbyist, to come online. Ariel, if you don't mind, you kind of gave us a preview last week of a potential 60-day package related to housing. Can you, and looking at the bill, if I looked at it online, it looks like there's 1 million amendments going back and forth. So can you kind of give us a sense of where things stand, what seems likely to happen, and just generally your thoughts on where we are with this issue?
Absolutely. Thanks, Patty. And hopefully you can hear me. I'm called in on the phone because my internet is unreliable again. Are you able to hear me? Okay, great. Yes. So things are continuing to move. We are still working on technical language for a component of the package as I speak. I think in terms of the budget, I'm pulling up a document that I'm going to put into the chat that I think will be helpful. That is an overview of House Bill 5019, which is the budget bill part of this package. And it incorporates the funding for everything that's in the package. So I think top priority for the league, of course, is looking at the homeless funding. And so this overview includes the governor's $130 million proposal for her emergency housing plan, which was, of course, focused just on the emergency areas of the state. What we also see in this package is an additional $27 million eligible for the balance of state, otherwise known as the Rural Oregon Continuum of Care. So between those two buckets of funding, we have the entire state funded, which is great. Details in terms of how those funds will go out. The $130 million is going to go through the emergency command structure and multi-agency collaborative MAC structure that the governor's office has been setting up in each of the emergency areas. For the balance of state, I think that question has not yet been decided. What we know from this governor is that she has made some really strong commitments and priorities towards some goals to accomplish by the end of this calendar year, and that is increasing shelter capacity, increasing shelter beds, rapidly rehousing folks, and getting some housing built. So That is the lens I think they're going to bring to the funding for the balance of state. And so they're going to be looking for ways to rapidly deploy that funding. Whether that's through, they have existing contractual relationships and structures set up with a community action agency network. However, I think there's also a recognition that that network is not adequately serving or quickly able, doesn't have the capacity to quickly get funds out in this manner or deploy shelter beds in all parts of the state. And so that's a consideration. We've been really pointing at the House Bill 4123 collaborative model, as we have established city-county partnerships in various parts of the balance of state that are ready to deploy these funds. We also, of course, have the Oregon Mayors Association proposal, which, it's not something that easily fits into this emergency funding plan from the governor. And we're continuing to look at our long-term strategy of, the overall ongoing, more long-term funding from the state. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I think we have an opportunity right now. I think those funds amount are pretty set. But in and around that, there's an opportunity to be having conversations either through your emergency command structure, if you're in an emergency area, or directly with Oregon Housing and Community Services, through myself, through the legislature, about your community's abilities and your city's ability and leadership and role to quickly deploy funds. I apologize. I have a very vocal assistant in the background whose daycare is closed today due to the storm. So want to point you to a couple avenues to do that. This bill was originally intended to be heard on yesterday, Thursday, I don't know what day it is, but due to the snowstorm, committees were canceled. So I think we're going to see it get posted for a public hearing on next Tuesday, next week, in House Housing and Homelessness Committee. So that's an opportunity to get on the record, either testifying virtually or in person, or submitting a letter and really telling your story. We also want to make sure that you're not letting up the pressure and you're really keeping the momentum going with your own individual legislators about the needs for homeless funding in your community, the proposal from the Oregon Mayors Association, and again, your leadership and your ability to quickly address the needs in your community. So whether that's through this emergency funding, whether that's through the long-term funding at the end of session, or otherwise, I think it's really important that your legislators know what the work that you're doing, the opportunity and the need. And so it's really important you continue to do that. Does that help with that budget piece? Patty, did you want me to go into more details about what else is in the package, or?
Yeah, I think if you can go over the package and then maybe touch on the OMA briefing book that we put online today as a benefit that might be useful for people as well.
Okay, excellent. So the other pieces in the package, in addition to those two pieces of emergency funding, the other parts of the package that haven't changed are there's $25 million for programs supporting homeless youth. There's $20 million for modular home production, for a program to do that and to fund production of modular housing within the state and rapidly deploy more affordable housing. There's a $3 million for a revolving loan fund that's intended to incentivize moderate income workforce housing with pre-development loans. These, could be used for infrastructure or other pre-development costs. There is a negotiated compromise between tenant advocates and the three major landlord groups that provides renters faced with eviction for non-payment with more time to access state and federal rent assistance and other services that would help them stay in their homes. So technically what it does is it lengthens the eviction notice timeline from 72 hours to 10 days and includes a right of redemption. And then it adds the package. Also, there's one addition, which is $5 million to improve on-site workforce housing for agricultural workers. Again, reflecting that these negotiations are continuing. And then a big piece that the LOC has been really closely engaged on is it's adding in the major components of what was House Bill 2889, which is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Program. This is a continuation of some existing statutory requirements that impact cities at 10,000 population and above. Already on the books was a requirement that cities of this size update their housing capacity analysis on a regular schedule. And then within 1 year of doing that, conducting what's called a housing production strategy. And so what this new legislation does is it adds the state is going to be creating actual housing targets based on that data and that work done at the local level and as well as at the state level in terms of how many homes actually need to be built to meet the need in each city and at what affordability level. And then it provides kind of a reporting, evaluation, and accountability structure for that. And so the LLC has been at the table for this. This, has been an expedited process for what is a very technical bill. I think one of the only reasons that's been possible for us to engage at this rate is because this policy, this program is, again, building off of 2019 legislation that already passed, and then also the state and DLCD and OHCS have been running work groups and doing studies with cities, counties, and other stakeholders at the table to really develop this policy. So there's really large alignment between key stakeholders on this going into session, and that's the only way we really have gotten to this point. The key pieces that we're really clearly still negotiating and confirming are in the bill is making sure that really ensuring that this bill does not create additional work or new work beyond what was already required in statute for cities, and really making sure there's a clear distinction between cities that are doing everything they can, really working on housing production strategies, but are still going to see for reasons outside of the city's control, because cities don't build housing, right? But for market factors, economic factors, you aren't going to be seeing production right away, or really probably at the level that's needed for at least a decade. And so we want to make sure that the state isn't, taking punitive action with cities where it shouldn't be. And also an important part of this bill is really the intent of the whole, the intent of this program is for the state to be leading with support and resources and prioritizing state resources, whether that be for technical assistance and capacity or infrastructure to actually help communities get housing built. So that's what that piece is about. And a number of city planners have also been very quickly behind the scenes the last few weeks, providing some really valuable technical support to me and to lobbyists to make sure that some really critical technical pieces make it into this bill and clarifications. So that's what's in the housing package. Again, there's also, there are some other amendments posted for this bill that my understanding will not be moving out as part of negotiation, but are out there in the world, one of which are some concepts that the home builders are proposing and other property owner developer advocates that would include some really unworkable preemptions for cities, including preempting cities from requiring any siting and design standards, statutory language that would require cities to approve like a high-rise building in a low-density neighborhood, or vice versa, a single-family home in the middle of your downtown core, development of preemptions that would, completely blow through any of your infrastructure planning or needs, and potentially you're planning around urban renewal areas or economic districts and investments there. So please watch that one. It's one that the Republican caucus has been really pushing in both the Senate and House side. Representative Helfrich is the vice chair of the House Housing and Homelessness Committee, and several of these amendments are being brought forward by him. So if you are in Hood River or in the Gorge, Cascade Locks area in his district, I really encourage you to reach out and share examples of why this concept is really not workable for cities. Patty, are we taking questions right now or later? I see stuff in the chat.
We're gonna hold till the end, but if you put a question in the chat, just know that we are tracking it and we'll get to it as soon as we're done with all updates. Ariel, quickly, I know you've been talking for a little bit, but did you want to point to the OMA briefing book as a source that people can use for some information to bolster some of their stories?
Yes. So Patty and Angela and other staff at OHCS have been working really hard, as have many cities, on developing one-page stories or explainers about the OMA Homeless Task Force proposal, both at a statewide level and at an individual city level. We have now have those one-pagers published as a booklet. It looks amazing. It is really telling a really compelling story from around the state of these really key important messages for the legislature of the need, the opportunity, the good work that you're doing, and what, how incredibly meaningful and critical it is for the state to invest in a meaningful partnership at the local level. So that is published online right now. I don't have the link handy, but I'm sure we can get that in the chat, and I think it's potentially in the bulletin and out on the LSC website. So that is a tool for you to use in your conversations with your legislators. And please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the content or how you can be, deepening your advocacy. We're on board for that.
Thank you, Ariel. And just in case, for those of you that get our bulletin, if you got today's bulletin, or when it goes out, sorry, there's a direct link in the bulletin to that OMA briefing book. And then Ariel, I don't mean to keep you on, but I do know that there is some legislation or some proposed bill, House Bill 2984, that you wanted to update the membership on. It has a potential impact on commercial properties being converted to residential. Can you give us a quick update on that and then finish with the OHCS budget before we move on?
Yes, thanks, Patty. So House Bill 2984 was scheduled for a public hearing in the House Housing and Homelessness Committee for Tuesday this week. I think that's going to get bumped to Thursday if it hasn't already due to the snowstorm. But this is a bill that we really want to get some educational testimony on the record. The LSC will be opposing it as it's currently introduced. The goal of the bill is to kind of remove barriers for communities to convert existing commercial buildings to residential. I think the legislature has been really interested in these potential opportunities, and I think that many of you know that those aren't always the most economic or feasible conversions, and maybe aren't as easy as they seem. That said, I think there are some opportunities out there. This bill would require cities to approve these conversions if they are converted to residential use for that would be affordable to moderate income workforce incomes at 120% of AMI and below for a period of 15 years. And you have to approve those without requiring a rezone or conditional use permit. I think that depending on your city and your pre-existing zoning, this may or may not be maybe a direction you're going already with your mixed use and your commercial zoning. It's definitely a direction that the state policy has been going largely with land use. The pieces of the bill that are more problematic or that we really are going to be coming out in opposition to is it also preempts cities from requiring any additional parking minimums other than what was originally required under the commercial use of the building. And then on SDCs, it preempts cities from collecting or charging an SDC for the lifetime of that 15-year affordability restriction. And I think that the proponents of the bill are operating under an assumption that commercial properties already pay more in SDC, so there shouldn't be an increase. Obviously, current SDC law and methodology is, you offer credits and whatever was already paid on the existing building wouldn't be charged again, but it's the increased impact of the conversion, right, of that new use of the building that you're looking at. And, commercial buildings don't typically pay parks SDCs, I think, in most of your communities. And so if you're talking about increasing residential homes, that's an impact to your park system. So what we're really looking for, we want to be good partners with Representative Marsh, who introduced this bill. She's been a really strong advocate for cities. She's championing our development capacity bill, which we'll talk about next week, but really want to put some examples on the record of why cities cannot afford to not charge these SDCs and what that means for these conversions. So if you have, specific examples of like, hey, here's a building in Medford or, in John Day that we've been wanting, could be useful for this, but this is the barrier if we are not able to charge SDCs. Here's the real impact if you're converting, a big box space to a 200 unit apartment versus a McDonald's to some duplexes. It's going to be different, but putting some examples to educate the committee on what this really means will be very helpful. You can do that in person, putting it on the record. Please do reach out if you have any questions about how to do that.
And then Ariel, if you can just put links sometime today before we're done with the webinar of where they can put their testimony in for both the 60-day package and that last bill you discussed, that'd be great. But can you give us a preview of the OHCS budget before we pivot somewhere else?
So one thing that is scheduled for a time certain is Thursday, the 2nd at 1 p.m. and the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Transportation and Economic Development is the Oregon Housing Community Services budget bill. If you read the bulletin, links to both of those, all of those I've talked about will be in that article. but really encouraging cities to get on the record, either in person, virtually, or on the record about your funding needs. That budget includes the bulk of the state and federal resources available in the state for both the development and preservation of affordable housing, for multifamily rental or home ownership programs, and of course, homelessness and housing stability prevention. So this is going to be a really important avenue for you to share your OMA proposals for your city, what direct funding would mean for you. So I really encourage you to get on the record with your advocacy on that piece.
Thank you, Ariel. We'll give you a break for a little bit, and I'll ask Michael Martin, who's our water lobbyist. Michael, I see your face, but if you can unmute and give us an update on place-based water planning funding.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for taking your time to spend with us today. The place-based water planning, our LOC Water and Wastewater Policy Committee recognized that place-based planning, while focusing on just a handful of specific geographic areas, that was important to completing the pilot programs for doing place-based water planning in specific basins. And what House Bill 3163, which will be part of the larger drought package, what House Bill 3163 does is continue that. It establishes a fund and continues that work. And really, there's a strong element of local control in this legislation. And as we sort of look to the future, the challenges that we'll have with water, there's that need to plan at the basin level. And this is important in critical legislation to expanding that work. And as Patty mentioned, there's a bulletin. Actually, I just saw that it came out just a little bit ago. It has a link to testifying. And what I'm asking quite simply is for our members to testify in support of this legislation that will continue that work. Building off an incredible amount of work that both Chair Helm of the Ag, Land Use, Water, and Natural Resources Committee and Vice Chair Owens have been doing on that. And so please support, and at the end, happy to answer any questions on this.
Thank you. Michael, is there any cities in particular or regions of the state that would be super helpful to support this bill in your estimation?
I would say, in short, all. That's why I brought it before. But in particular, I just say, everybody, because I think it's been happening since about 2015, this place-based planning, but this is continuing to lay the groundwork that really shows that when it comes to water, the challenges that we're going to have in the future, as we looked at allocation, and particularly the unique situations that each basin, not all basins are created equally, is that doing that local work is critical, convening people, bringing them together on the table. And that's, in short, what this bill does.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. And if you could drop, I know it's in the bulletin, but just for ease of reference, if you could drop in the chat where you want people to give testimony, that'd be helpful. Speaking of people coming together and working on things, Jim, if you want to come back down and let us know where we stand with the semiconductor package. I think when we talked last week, you said that we had an initial proposal and we shouldn't see it as an ending point. Where are we today?
Yeah, thank you. So we now have a bill. It's Senate Bill 4. Like everything that we were bringing up today, we have all of these items in our bulletin with more detail, and is a good place to certainly go to for any additional questions, as well as the direction that we're asking for help in this following week. So semiconductor package as it stands right now, it's getting better. We started with kind of a shell, and we're starting to see a little bit more detail on it. We still have a little ways to go to make sure that we get all of the critical elements that are in there. Part of what's really important to understand is the significance of this investment. Again, this is $52 billion from the federal level with the CHIPS Act. This is really unprecedented. A lot of reasons for doing this, and a lot of what's been focused on the narrative here in the last few days is really the national security side of things. There are 3 countries that control 85% of the chip market worldwide. That's Taiwan, China, and South Korea. And I think we all found out during the pandemic what it's like when you have a supply chain interruption and how many different products that we buy, let alone, I'll say, military products that require chips to make them function. So that is really part of the driving force behind this, is to provide some long-term security for the U.S. In terms of, again, that national security, but also for all of the other products that we end up developing. So $52 billion is at stake, and it's going to be incumbent for the state of Oregon to make sure that they have a package that is competitive, that is bold, and is comprehensive. So our primary focus as cities in this conversation has been to make sure that leadership understands. And leadership, I mean the governor, that means the Senate president, and that means the House Speaker. We have a joint committee on semiconductors group right now that is bipartisan and bicameral. Every one of those committee members are on board with the structure of a semiconductor package that, again, it's comprehensive, it's bold, and it includes all of the recommendations that came out of this statewide task force that was done here in the last year. Sunset extensions for enterprise zone program is critical for this, as well as the SIP gain share program. Those two areas, or those two program areas, have sunsets in the next couple of years, and it's important to get those things extended, largely because it shows Department of Commerce that we're serious as a state, and we do have a long-term commitment to business development in Oregon. Those are really key, and that's really something that the league has been pushing on. I think we're actually making some headway on that, and I will say largely because of the involvement that we've had from the grassroots level. The cities who have chimed into this from across Oregon have been incredibly helpful to drive home this message. So we're still keeping our foot on the accelerator for those pieces, because we're not done with this conversation, and I don't want to rely on, I'll say, the last piece of communication that went out. So keep that in mind. The other elements that are very important to this is the research and development tax credit. That is something that 38 other states have got, and every state that is vying for this federal funding has a R&D tax credit. It's critical to attract businesses to put in $100 million or a $500 million type of project, and it provides that type of incentive. We are already probably behind a bit from a few states: Texas, New York, Washington State, Arizona, and even Kansas at this point in time are in the conversation for potential investments. And Oregon needs to basically, again, restate where we're at. We have a substantial footprint as it stands right now with the semiconductor industry. And I would hate to walk away from the investments that have been made over the last 30 plus years in Oregon. So the other two components really that are important, again, a committed investment with Oregon's workforce via both the higher education institutions, which go all the way from your community colleges up through the university system, but also certainly those workforce organizations that are around the state as well. And then the final piece that we're really focused in on here is the land use system. We absolutely have to have a change, especially for siting on some of these lands, to make sure that we can get a shovel in the ground in a short period of time. Those are all, again, part of those original recommendations that came out of this task force, and remain consistent with basically the advocacy that we have been providing. The other part of this that is important to bring up is that all of us who've been involved in this conversation, and I mean all of us in terms of coalition members, so the business community has been part of this conversation, the university system has been part of this conversation, trades, labor, et cetera, virtually everybody under the sun that you can imagine has been part of this conversation. But again, to kind of get us over this last little hump, we need to keep our foot on the accelerator, keep your communication flowing out there, and really focus in on really that leadership group. So again, the Senate President's office, it's the House Speaker, and it's also the governor's office. And if you have those folks in your district, certainly reach out to them directly. If you have other legislators, make sure that they understand that they need to reach out as well, and make sure that they are supporting efforts to have a comprehensive package put together as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Jim. And just to kind of make it even more clear, even if members have already reached out, you're asking them to keep reaching out continuously until we get this package across the finish line.
Definitely. We never rely on one touch point as lobbyists. And I don't think anybody on this call or who's had a chance to have that previous conversation should rely on that as well. The final piece here to maybe close the loop for some folks, there's a lot of legislators that are, when they're back in district on weekends, if they've got a town hall, a coffee, or anything of that nature, that is a perfect opportunity to engage with them as well.
Thank you, Jim. And I know we've got questions in the chat. Please know we will get to them. We just want to get through some of the main substance today first. Lindsay Tennis. Lindsay, I think I see you on there. If you can turn your camera on. Lindsay's our tax and finance lobbyist. Lindsay, you're going to give us an update on the state economist Mark McMullen's update on our budget forecast. Are we looking good? Is it bad? Is it too soon to tell? Where are we?
Yeah, hi everyone. Lindsay Tennis, tax finance and economic development lobbyist. The top line message is that we are looking pretty good in the last economic forecast. The economists actually took out a assumption recession for the forecast that they had put in when they did the last one in December. So this forecast no longer included a baseline recession assumption. They did say that the market conditions, we will probably see a recession at some point. They don't know like how big or when. It could be that it's just pushed off, but it's often something that happens after high periods of inflation like we are experiencing. There's like a bust boom scenario. So that is still on the horizon. Some of the other interesting things they talked about were the decline in growth population in Oregon. That's also something that you see in a recession, like the pandemic related recession, that the growth in population in Oregon would have gone down. They thought that would have started to rebound by this year, but it hasn't yet. So I think the economists are kind of just waiting to see what happens with our population. But a lot of that population growth is usually from people in their 20s and 30s looking for higher wage jobs. So if Oregon doesn't start to see that rebound, we could be in a little bit of trouble. And then one piece they touched on that is really important to cities is marijuana revenues. So those, they put in an 11% reduction in marijuana revenues into this forecast. And that's due to a highly saturated market with a lot of producers and a lot of retailers. Essentially, there's too much product, too much supply, and that has lowered the prices of marijuana because it's taxed on the price. That has led to their baseline assumption that it's an 11% reduction in marijuana revenues. And as you all know, some of that goes to cities. So we will see a reduction of that as prices of marijuana continue to be extremely low.
So not great news, but maybe not terrible. Is that your assumption?
I would say overall, the state's economy is pretty good. Yeah. But it's kind of a mixed bag. And I think there's a lot of factors that we're trying to still see how Oregon is faring as we come out of COVID and as things start to regulate again.
Thank you, Lindsay. We're going to finish up today's primary remarks from LOC lobbyist Scott Winkles. Scott handles our general government's portfolio. And Scott, I believe you've got two things you want to talk to us about today. One of which I believe is Senate Bill 850, which has some implications for our public construction projects. And then I think you're going to finish out your presentation on Senate Bill 848, which is regarding a duty to defend. Is that correct?
That is correct, Patty. Thank you very much. Again, Scott Winkles, lobbyist on the general government portfolio and some other things. I'm going to start with a bill that was supposed to be heard this week. It was all canceled due to snow, but it's already popped on the calendar again. We had hoped that the snow would have caused cooler heads to prevail and it would disappear, but that doesn't appear to be the case. And I think you're going to expect to see an alert coming out from our members. Coming out in your inbox. The bill, we call it the PLA bill, Public Labor Agreement Bill, and what the bill does is pretty troubling. Currently, the requirement to have a public labor agreement on a public contracting or a construction contract is $10 million. And so at that point, the contractor has to demonstrate that they have an agreement with with the construction trades union or similar in order for the project to move forward. At $10 million, it can be problematic, but at that point you're laying big steel, and so most of that work is going to come out of an iron hall. The iron workers, that's who has that capability. Dropping it to $1 million would include add a new universe of projects that would have to have these PLAs, and there simply aren't enough contractors out there to do this work. About right now, the union to open shop ratio is about 80% open, 20% union. So these contractors would have to demonstrate that they have these labor agreements. It's going to increase costs significantly on these projects, and there's no shortage of construction work out there right now. So what we think will happen is that some of the contractors that we've been relying on to do these public improvements can go do other things. We know that there's an existing shortage with the current labor rubric. One of the things I do for the league is also emergency management lobbying, and my understanding of how a public agency typically reacts in a declared emergency, and we are in a declared housing emergency, is you lighten the burdens on issuing contracts. You make it easier for you to meet the needs. It's very odd that we would be seeking to put in 36,000 houses this year, which is 98 a day, while at the same time making it harder to hire and do this work. The other thing that this bill does, and I will confess, the language is so inartfully crafted that we're not really sure what it means, is that it would require that any project that used any ARPA dollars made available to the state meet the PLA requirement. That is troubling for a number of reasons, not the least of which is we're not entirely certain that the federal government would allow that. The other issue is that the ARPA projects that we're aware of are largely already planned out and scoped. This is limited duration. These are limited duration funds. Agencies have already started reporting. It'd be very problematic to put this new requirement in. And by the way, this was direct appropriation from the federal government to cities and counties directly. And the reason they did that was because of the highly problematic CARES Act distribution model, which we probably all remember and don't need to get into in detail. And so we're looking forward to some amendments. I think the chair realizes there are some problems. I think some of the alternatives that they've offered actually make the situation worse, allegedly giving cities different options, but they don't do anything about alleviating the ability of a competing contractor to challenge a bid award, which would again send this to court and slow down the process. So very troubling piece of legislation, particularly while we're trying to solve our housing crisis. The other bill I'm going to talk to you about today is 848. This is duty to defend. This essentially shifts the requirement, some liability requirements from A&E design professionals, architects and engineers primarily, onto other participants in a construction project. It would prohibit the ability, most public contracts have a requirement that the contractor indemnify the employer or the contracting agency for their own errors and omissions. Essentially, this bill would require the public agency and the taxpayer to fund the defense costs for a design professional up until the point it's determined if what their portion of liability is. It would treat them differently than the other participants within the project. So the contractor, the material supplier, the project owner, they would all cover their own defense costs should a claim arise. It is a troubling bill. It's not often you see in the League of Oregon Cities walking hand in hand in the building with the Oregon Association of Trial Lawyers and the contracting community and the material suppliers all at the same time. But that's what's going on here. We look forward to having a strong showing in front of the Senate Judiciary next week, but please be advised there could be an alert on this bill. In the future, I will do my best to resolve the matter at the committee level.
Thanks, Scott. And then if you don't mind, if you need testimony and help from cities, if you can drop links into the chat for them, that'd be great. I'd appreciate it. We've got about 15 minutes before we hit our hard stop at 1 o'clock. I want to take the questions in the order in which I saw them pop up. Please be mindful of that. I'm going to start with Mayor Tim Rosner of Sherwood in the chat. Mayor Rosner, you asked, and Ariel, I believe this is a question for you. I know you're having some internet issues, but this one should be for you, Ariel. The mayor's question is there anything in the plan to provide transitional services as young adults come out of foster care to mitigate the homeless rate for those turning 18 and just entering adult life?
Great question. So I think the 25 million that's specifically for programs supporting homeless youth would have that flexibility. It's not under the same kind of shelter bed lens that the governor's emergency plan is under. So I would imagine that those are existing in this is building off of an existing program at DHS. And so I think that they have several strategies that they're able to utilize for that. So yes.
Thank you, Ariel. I've got one more from you from Councillor Chaplin. You can kick it to Ari if you would prefer, but she does ask, how will CAA in the ROOC work with local and state EOCs?
So I think that is kind of still getting worked out. They don't have kind of the emergency command structure set up for the balance of state unless, the governor has set out a venue for counties to petition into the emergency declaration if they want to. So that is one thing you could be doing with your county partners if that's of interest. But I think that the OHCS, the housing agency, is going to be figuring out the details of where funds go in the balance of state. And again, they're going to be looking for how they can quickly do that, how it can be focused on the governor's priorities. And that's where I think, for better or for worse, cities have an opportunity to kind of get in there, with your provider partners as well. I think the message really needs to be one of strong coordination at the ground level. I think that's been one of the things we've heard on the OMA proposal is that, well, this is, I think folks are saying is this is just for cities and whatever funding that goes out needs to be coordinated. Well, of course, you all are coordinating on the ground. That's the point. But that message could be stronger coming from cities, I think. So that's where you're going to want to be really talking to your legislators to help them, so they can help you connect to the state process and make that case.
Okay, thank you, Ariel. And Mayor Callaway, I know you didn't have one in the chat, but you did have a comment when we were talking about the semiconductor package. For those who don't know, Mayor Steve Callaway of Hillsborough is the LOC president this year. So President Callaway.
Thank you. So I was just going to kind of dovetail on Jim's comment about the research and development tax credit. All of Intel's research and development is done here in the state of Oregon. Lamb Research, which is a presence in Sherwood, as well as Tigard, research is in the name of their company. So, we have those are just two examples of the many industries, that do research and development in our state. And, we used to have an R&D tax credit, but it is sunsetted. It has gone away. And it's just time, especially as we're competing with other states, just to make sure that we are, through our own choices as a state, not creating an unlevel playing field. We need to make sure that we are leveling this playing field up. Thank you.
Thank you, President Callaway. The next question I had that came in was another question from Mayor Rosner of Sherwood. Mayor Sherwood asked, where are we at with executive authority to bring large parcels into UGBs to accelerate making land available in a timely manner as it relates to the CHIP Act? And Jim, I believe that one's a question for you.
That is me. Good question. So that is one of those components that we are still pushing. That's really effectively the land use portion of those recommendations that came out of the task force, which I want to make sure I mention. Mayor Callaway was on the task force as well. So yeah, that'll be part of really where we and others are accelerating our communication with leadership in the next week or so. We think there are some ways to do it. We know that there is going to be concern from some of the land use advocacy groups that are out there that may not want it, but that's going to be really a key piece to this overall semiconductor package, because we can't wait for 2 years. We'll have, the funds will be gone by then, or they'll be allocated by then to the other states that are competing for it. And Oregon will have lost their opportunity to, again, invest and leverage on the work that's already been done over the last 30 years. It's pretty amazing when you think that Oregon, and specifically Hillsborough and Washington County, are ground central for research and development, not just in this country, but the world, in terms of chips production.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to stick with you. We've got a question from Jennifer Jolly. She's asked, is the environmental community on board with the semiconductor package, and have they been participating in the discussions? Yeah,
so kind of the same along the lines. There's been concerns that have been offered by, I'll say 1,000 Friends. That's probably the primary advocacy group that's been at least a little bit involved in some of the hearings. Farm Bureau has expressed some concerns as well. Again, primarily over that, I'll just say, supersiting of lands. So we know that there's going to be some opposition out there. There's concerns that have been brought forward on some of the tax incentives too, but it's not any different than what we faced before when we've gone through different sunsets.
Okay, I'm going to stick with you. This is more of a comment from Anne in Albany, but I do think there's a question buried in there. She said, Jim, shovel-ready industrial land, cities need funding to make needed infrastructure improvements, and she gives some examples of what's happening in Albany. Are we looking for funding for infrastructure improvements for these types of projects? Is that part of the package, or is that something else?
Yeah, thank you for that. Great question. That's something that I should have mentioned as well. So there's roughly $200 million that have been allocated for this semiconductor package. It's not all going to go to infrastructure investment. There's going to be, I'll say, some spreading of the peanut butter out there, because university system is going to need some additional investment. Workforce development is going to need some additional investment. But this is going to be one of those key pieces for local governments to get those into that site-ready condition. I think the survey work that cities had a chance to participate in here in the fall and early winter of 22 showed that almost 60% of the cities that responded lost business opportunities because they didn't have access to cash or have industrial lands ready to go. So yeah, that is still part of the mix. We just don't know how much, but it will be part of the funding.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I do see Joe Barker, you have your hand up. What's your question?
Thank you, Patty. Well, it's a clarification, and it's for Scott Winkles. I greatly understand the concepts that he was articulating under SB 858. However, when I downloaded SB 858 this morning, it's the formation of a children's services district. Did that whole bill get changed, or?
No, I had a fat finger moment. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
No, 858 is also a bad bill. It is also, I think we've got that one bottled up though.
Okay, so what was the actual bill number? 848. Thank you so much, Jim. Scott, sorry.
I just fat fingers and no glasses, so yeah.
Yeah, I know what that's like, having bad fingers.
All right. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat. There is a comment from Bill Grupp with Aurora. Hello, Bill. He's just said that Siemens EDA, formerly Mentor Graphics, also does a large amount of semiconductor research in the Wilsonville area. If anybody has any additional questions or comments on any of the particular proposals, please let me know. Lindsay, I see your hand up. If that means if you want to make a comment on something we've missed, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I forgot to say this earlier, but I just wanted to say thank you for everyone that submitted testimony for the hearings on enterprise zone and industrial land extension that was supposed to happen yesterday. All committees were canceled yesterday due to the winter weather. So we expect those to get rescheduled. So we will probably send out another alert when those get rescheduled. But yeah, thank you to everyone. I was looking at the testimony and we got some really, really great stories on how you all have used enterprise zones successfully.
Lindsay, are they going to need to resubmit that same testimony when it's rescheduled, or will it automatically carry over for them?
It will stay on the record. Yes, it'll still show up on that bill.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm not seeing any other questions or hands raised. If you have one, we've got 6 minutes left. I do want to pivot back quickly to Jim at the start of this hour. He had mentioned and just kind of generally explained some of our lobbying efforts and some of the challenges we faced. I wanted to give anybody an opportunity really quickly. If you had a specific question on particular legislative concerns, that would be great. And actually, I do have a question in the chat from Ton Bronson with Astoria. He says, what's the bill number on enterprise zones? Lindsay, if you don't mind putting that in the chat for him and everybody else, as well as a link to any testimony, I think that might be the easiest way to do it. I also have a question from Paul Thompson with the Lane County COG. Do we have any insight on the future of House Bill 2659 CFEC implementation? I'm hearing it doesn't have life, but our local jurisdictions would like an update. Ariel, if you're still on the line, I'm thinking you're running point on CFEC still.
Yes, on the CFEC, we actually have 2 vehicles, that bill in the House as well as one in the Senate. The language is somewhat of placeholder language, but really the intent is for the legislature to direct DLCD to improve the rules, because the climate-friendly equitable communities rulemaking that DLCD initiated as a result of Governor Brown's executive order on greenhouse gas emissions, the rules that came out are not implementable in the majority of cities that and counties that are impacted. So we have a number of cities that have pursued litigation to the same end, which again has been not do work on climate-friendly and ethical communities, but to improve the rules, to fix the rules so they can actually be implementable. We are having a number of legislative conversations behind the scenes. I think we are looking to get those bills scheduled soon in committees to have some hearings and some important public conversations on the rules. But I think we are cautiously optimistic. We're seeing a growing understanding from legislators about the complexity, the prescriptive nature of the rules, how problematic it is. And the other piece of it is that the governor's budget does not fund the rules at all. The department had originally quoted the cost of implementation at 10 million. Cities know it's closer to 30 million to fully fund that work. And so that is also part of the conversation. And I'm happy to talk more about it offline.
Thank you, Ariel. And Councillor Bronson, just so you know, Lindsay has put that bill number and link in the chat for you if you're monitoring that. And then I think we have time for one last question. And I see Councillor Hall from Haynes with his hand raised. Councillor Hall, if you want to unmute.
Yes, I think it's probably Scott Winkles here. Is there something going on to make it easier for small cities and special districts to sort of some of these contractual rules? There's some flexibility in there, because especially it's really hard in small cities and special districts to find people to do the job in the first place. And so is that in a bill someplace?
It's not in a bill someplace currently. I think that would be reducing the requirements would be a significant lift. I mean, I think it depends on how the governor uses the emergency declaration statute, because there are some ways to alleviate that in that statute, but it's narrow. I'm not sure it would be applicable, but that's something we could take a look at.
Okay, thank you, Scott. We've got about 1 minute left. If you do have other questions or comments, please know that all of the lobbyists have put their emails in the chat. You can email them directly. You can also email me, and please continue to track our stuff on the legislative website at www.orcities. Before we sign off today, just want to quickly remind everybody that registration for the League's spring conference in Seaside actually opened this past Wednesday. We do have a limited number of seats available, as well as a limited number of hotel rooms. So if it's something that you're interested in, it's happening April 25th through the 26th, and we do encourage you to sign up soon. You can find that on our website as well. We're also offering 2 public budgeting classes in the next month, Public Budgeting 101. This would be a good class if you have new members of your local budget committee. We have one on March 7th from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. That's meant to accommodate those professionals who have day jobs and can't take time off of work. We have one the following day on March 8th from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. That's really meant more for people who either don't have a day job from 8 to 5 or for city staff. And then last, but by all means, no means least, Mayor Steve Calloway of Hillsborough, our LOC president, is hosting a series of regional meetings across the state. Within those meetings, he's giving an update on the league's 5-year strategic plan. He's seeking feedback and comments from the membership on that plan. And we've also been providing the most up-to-date information on where cities stand in securing direct funding for their homelessness response and prevention efforts. Each meeting starts at 11 a.m. and ends at 1 p.m. We are providing lunch, so there's no charge for you to attend, but we do ask that you register in advance so we can get a proper head count so we know how much food to handle. The next meeting is going to be on March 9th in Phoenix, followed on March 10th in Chiloquin. You can find a full listing of those dates and the ability to register at our website at www.orcities.org. It is exactly 1 p.m. We hit the nail on the head. So thank you very much for attending and tuning in. Follow us on our website. Please make sure to read today's bulletin for more detailed information of what you heard here today. And we will do our best to be back in touch with you all next week with more information. Thank you and have a great week.